American history is housed in the National Archives, 44 of them spread all over the country. They contain documents, photos, maps, artifacts that go back to our founding fathers. Every school kid knows about some of them: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. But there are millions of others, from the patent for Michael Jackson's moonwalking shoes to Benedict Arnold's loyalty oath. Many are priceless treasures, which means they attract not only scholars but thieves, more and more of them all the time. Getting to the crooks before they get to the archives has become a new priority in law enforcement. No one knows more about this than Barry Landau, a self-described presidential historian and one of the foremost collectors of presidential memorabilia. That's because Barry Landau carried out the largest theft of these treasures in American history. Prosecutors say he is one of the most accomplished con men they have ever encountered.
The story will continue in a moment.
For decades, he was a regular guest at the White House. Here he is with President Ford and Queen Elizabeth. He's the guy with the beard.
Well...
He showed up with President Reagan and Nancy at the inaugural gala in 1985 and met a whole bunch of presidents: Richard Nixon, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton. He wrote an impressive picture-laden book, The President's Table, and was invited to the finest anchor desks in town.
Barry H. Landau is a presidential historian.
The story of the ultimate inauguration collector.
But when we met up with him in June, he no longer wanted to tell his story. He'd been convicted of the single largest theft of historic artifacts in the United States. He stole thousands of items, including hundreds of documents signed by some of the most famous names in history: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Francis Scott Key, Marie Antoinette, Voltaire. He'd pilfered them from museums and libraries all over the country. U.S. Attorney Rod Rosenstein was in charge of the prosecution. He was a con man?
Barry Landau was a con artist, and he used his reputation as a presidential historian in order to gain the confidence of museums and other people who had custody of important documents, and then he stole them.
It was a reputation, it turns out, that was the product of his rich imagination. Landau claimed he'd worked for every president since Lyndon Johnson had served as chief of protocol at the White House.
But in fact, there's no evidence that Barry Landau was ever employed by any White House or had any of the relationships that he claimed to have, or indeed had any legitimate job at all.
The Landau case and a few others let law enforcement know they had a problem they hadn't really been aware of until very recently.
Every institution now that has collections is threatened. We all know that there's a major threat, and it's getting larger.
Former Secret Service employee Paul Brockfield is the Inspector General of the National Archives. He runs the tiny and little-known archival recovery team, armed federal agents and historians who, along with the FBI, go after stolen national treasures. Now, Landau, was he a good thief? Was he a good con man?
From everybody I talked to, he was a master thief because he did it over a duration of time. He shopped. He got what he shopped for.
A trusted researcher and regular at libraries around the country, Landau's strategy, along with his accomplice, they conquered with kindness, as they did here at the Maryland Historical Society, where Pat Anderson is the director. Some thieves work with knives, others with guns. These guys worked with cupcakes.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. They brought us cupcakes, and the second time they visited, they brought cookies. Evidently, they took treats to every repository they visited.
And it worked.
It did work.
But on July 9th last year, the esteemed Mr. Landau got careless, and Pat Anderson's archivist got suspicious, caught them stealing, and called the police. How many things did they have when they were caught?
They had 60 pieces of our library material.
Okay, now this is some of the stuff they stole. Tell me what we're looking at.
They're inauguration souvenirs.
From which inaugurations?
This is Grover Cleveland. And these are fun. Tickets to Andrew Johnston's impeachment trial in the U.S. Senate. And they grabbed a fistful of those.
I bet. There wasn't much security at the Maryland Historical Society, but still, how do you walk out in front of the librarian's desk with 60 documents? The secret was sartorial, deep pockets. And those are his costumes.
These are the jackets that Mr. Landau used and he had altered in order to steal items from the historical societies. Now what's interesting about these coats is that he arranged for a tailor to install interior pockets, hidden pockets inside the jackets that are large enough to fit these documents.
Landau had a whole collection of them, including a trench coat. How did you react when you saw his jackets?
Fascinated. Again, in my world, every criminal is different. Every thief is different, and you just always you kind of respect them. You kind of learn from them.
After the bust in Maryland, Inspector General Brockfield on the FBI decided it would be a good idea to get a search warrant for Landau's apartment in New York. It was your agents who broke into Landau's apartment. How did they react when they found what they found?
Well, my focus was getting them a truck, because when we got to Mr. Landau's apartment, we came to the quick realization that we needed a truck. This was by far, in terms of quantity, the largest amount of documents and artifacts that we've ever recovered from one site.
10,000 items, including 300 of extraordinary historical value. What were they worth on the market?
I think the value was astronomical. For me, it's so difficult to put an empirical number on them. It's basically how much the market would bear. For all I know, to some collector, one document might have been worth millions.
All of these were found in Landau's apartment?
All these documents were seized from Mr. Landau's apartment in New York City.
There were remarkable documents. Letters signed by Mark Twain, Sir Isaac Newton, Charles Dickens. A document penned by Lorenzo de' Medici 533 years ago. An epitaph written by Benjamin Franklin for himself. And he wrote, "Lies here food for the worms, yet the work shall not be lost." Pretty good stuff. A letter written by John Hancock with a real John Hancock signature. And for 20th century buffs, there was the original reading copy of FDR's 1937 inaugural address. This one.
1/3 of a nation, ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished.
It was a rainy day, and in fact, the reading copy of the speech, the document the president read from that day, was waterlogged, and you can see that on the document that we seized from Mr. Landau.
And Landau didn't just steal from historical libraries. He had taken his campaign of kindness all the way to the White House, befriending President Clinton's former secretary, Betty Currie, who made the mistake of inviting Landau to her house. Landau was pretty good at making friends with people who could help him, wasn't he? Spent nights at her place.
Bad offer to invite him into your house.
He arrived at her house with one suitcase and left with two.
The assistant U.S. attorney actually I even upped that. I think he said it was 3 in court. So Betty Currie should have gotten up early that morning and basically escorted him out the door. I guess there's a lesson to be learned. If you have a house guest, say goodbye to them in your driveway.
He robbed her of more than 250 items, including copies of presidential speeches from her personal collection. Naturally, we wanted to ask Barry Landau about all of this, so this summer we tried to talk to him in New York City. Bob Simon, 60 Minutes. Talk to us a minute. No. Just answer some questions. You're being accused of a lot of things, and we want to hear your side of it. They say, the prosecution says you're a con man, a thief. What do you say to that? Don't you have anything to say at this point, in your own defense? Landau may have been the maestro of his craft, but there have been other thieves. This summer, prosecutors put Leslie Waffen behind bars. He was in charge of the Archive's Audio and Film Records Department. He stole thousands of original recordings and sold them on eBay. Gems like this eyewitness account of the Hindenburg disaster.
It's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. It's spoken and saved all the humanity.
Another employee stole most of the presidential pardons from the Philadelphia archives, as well as hundreds of photos taken by astronauts in space and on the moon.
Do you look on eBay to look for suspicious documents?
That would be one of the sites we would look at. Many times, when a thief is trying to move a document on the internet, the buyer may be a federal agent, and that's real sweet.
You're talking sting operations?
Yes.
Have you been successful with sting operations?
Yes. We ask our sentinels, and historians and collectors and dealers to help us. We go where a lot of federal employees usually aren't welcome. We'll go to gun shows. We'll go to dealer shows.
Like the Civil War Collectors Fair in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Here, hundreds of dealers and thousands of visitors show up every year to meander and to buy. Many documents, including a few signed by Ulysses Grant and Robert E. Lee, are for sale. Have any of them been stolen from archives or museums? That's what archival recovery team agents Kelly Maltagliati and Mitch Yackelson are looking for. What would you be happiest to find?
We're missing the Wright brothers patent. That would thrill me to no end to recover the patent for the flying machine of 1903.
When did it disappear?
We don't even know. We discovered it was missing around 2003 when a staff member had wanted to pull it for an exhibit commemorating the centennial.
Also missing, the bombing maps of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So where did these things end up?
In foreign countries, for example, in Eastern Europe, there is a market, a black market, for American historical documents.
How do these black markets function? Where are they?
Well, I think it's like any illegal market anywhere in the world. If you know of somebody who has a lot of money and wants to collect significant unique items, and you make that connection, then you may well be able to make the sale.
But Barry Landau has been put out of business. This summer, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison, and that's not all.
Even after Mr. Landau is released from prison, he will be prohibited from visiting museums, libraries, or any other places where documents are deposited.
One after effect of the Landau case is that security is being tightened in many of these places. Pat Anderson is imposing new rules in the Maryland Historical Society.
Our patrons are no longer allowed to wear jackets in the reading room. And it's unfortunate, some of our older patrons, they get chilly, and we have to say, I'm sorry. And so we, they can wear a shawl, but they can't wear jackets.
You're going to have to hand out blankets.
Well, exactly, and hope that they don't have pockets in them.
Yeah.
And Ms. Anderson will not just be hoping, she'll be there on the front lines guarding our past.
You are the custodians of more than these documents. You're sort of the custodians of American history.
Yes, we are. We're the stewards. We make sure it gets from one generation to the next. This is what survives of the American past. We never have all of it, which is what makes what survives so much more important. These things don't belong to us. They belong to the American people.
After we finished reporting this story, longtime Inspector General Paul Brockfield was put on administrative leave with pay, in part for allegedly leaking sensitive information to 60 Minutes. He denies the allegations against him.
Go to 60minutesovertime.com to hear Bob Simon talk about the surprise interview in this story, sponsored by Pfizer.